Hello everyone and welcome to this Learning and Work Institute event. My name's Stephen Evans. I'm the Chief Executive of the Learning and Work Institute and I'm chairing today. Now we talk a lot about public investment in skills and the falls we've seen over the last 10 years and some of the impacts that has had. But we perhaps talk a little bit less about employer investment in skills, and that's what today's event is all about. And it's to talk about a research report that we've published today, and we're very grateful for the support of NOCN to make that report possible as part of their support of the Festival of Learning. And I think it paints quite a worrying picture of where we are overall in terms of employer investment in skills, the sort of trends we've seen and some of the inequalities, and then also how policy isn't perhaps doing what I would argue it should do to sort of tackle that or improve things. And this really matters. This is really important if we're going to recover from the pandemic and grow the economy beyond that. So really important topic. And we've got a galaxy of excellent speakers to talk about this, and we want to make sure we got lots of questions and comments through Slido as well. So do please put your questions in the Q&A box there, and do tweet away as well if you're on social media. So I'm going to be we'll have sort of plenty of time for questions and to hear from the panelists and to bring in some of the comments from everybody tuning in. But I'm going to start by asking Naomi Clayton, who's Deputy Director at the Learning and Work Institute, one of the co-authors of this report. I'm going to ask her to run through some of the key findings to kick us off. So Naomi, over to you.
Brilliant, thank you, Stephen. I'm just going to share my screen. So hopefully you can all see that. So I'm going to give you an overview of the key findings from the report. I should say there's lots more detail and crucially more charts in the report. So do take a look at that. That's available on our website. So hopefully the slides will change. So we know that employer investment in skills is a key contributor to productivity growth and innovation, and it offers pathways for individuals in terms of their career and earnings progression too. So as Stephen says, it's incredibly important. But what we also know is that it was declining prior to the pandemic. So if you look at the orange bars here in this chart that shows the proportion of employers that funded or arranged training in the last 12 months, we can see that that proportion fell from 66% in 2017 to 61% in 2019. And when we look at training days, which tends to be a good indication of training's contribution to skills formation, we can see that they've also fallen, both in terms of training days per trainee in the orange line and per employee in the blue line. And we can see that that's at its lowest level since 2011. So in 2019, employers provided 99 million training days, but that's 20 million fewer than if levels had in 2011 had been maintained. So some of the reasons why that might be, why we've seen that decline, is partly linked to the kind of weak economic growth since the financial crisis in 2008-9, but also the economic uncertainty that followed the EU referendum, which has had impacts on employer investment in skills. So we've seen a decline in investment prior to the pandemic. And training investment in training is also lower than the EU average and compared to EU countries. So a relatively high proportion of UK employers provide training, if you look at along the x-axis in this chart. But training costs per employee are half the EU average, if you look along the y-axis. And so that's around equivalent to around a £6.5 billion loss in training if you were to increase investment levels to the EU average. And then alongside this decline and comparatively low levels of investment internationally, we also know that access to training is highly unequal. So we know that there are disparities between different types of business. And what we've seen is that higher value, more knowledge intensive sectors like business services and IT have increased their investment in training, while investment in among kind of lower wage sectors such as retail and hospitality has fallen. So we see disparities between businesses and also within them. So we can see here that graduates are 4 times more likely to participate in job-related training than workers with no qualifications. And in general, we see that low-paid, low-qualified workers are less likely to access training, and that really works to kind of reinforce the kind of wider inequalities that we see in the labour market. If we look at what's been happening during the pandemic over the course of the kind of last year and a half, we can see that employer investment in training has actually fallen more sharply during the pandemic than it did after the financial crisis, particularly among consumer services firms, which is unsurprising given the impacts that we know have or at least the way that the pandemic has impacted on consumer services firms. So 40% of firms reported a decline in training expenditure, compared to just 6% reporting an increase in the middle of 2020. This is according to the CBI survey of the services sector. And talked about the impact on consumer services. That's clearly had a knock-on effect on their expenditure on training. And businesses in this sector were twice as likely to report a decline in investment on training. And in terms of the impacts on different groups of workers, we've seen that young people in particular, so 16 to 24-year-olds on the left-hand side of this chart, have seen among the sharpest falls in participation in training over the course of the pandemic, particularly those who are in the private sector. And this is on top of kind of sharper long-term declines that we've seen in participation in training among young people. And we find a similar pattern for apprenticeships too, where the falls during the pandemic in apprenticeship starts have been sharpest for young people and among apprenticeships at level 2. So that's what's been happening over the longer term and during the pandemic. If we look at what the government's doing to support employer investment, we can see that clearly the government plays a really significant role in employer investment in skills. But increasingly, it follows or even reinforces some of the inequalities that I've talked about, rather than tackling them. So here, this chart just it's from the IFS, not from the DFE, looking at total government spending on adult education and skills. And we can see that overall spending on work-based learning for adults, including apprenticeships, has fallen by about 18% over the last decade. And that equates to around 26% when you look at levels of spend per worker. And the cuts to the adult education budget in particular mean that there are fewer opportunities for people to learn at lower levels. I mentioned that those figures included spending on apprenticeships, and if we look at spending on apprenticeships, including the levy, then that rose by about 50% in real terms over that same time period. But we've also seen that these reforms have led to a fall in the number of apprenticeships, and opportunities have skewed away from young people and lower levels of learning. And this chart here just highlights that fall in employers with at least one apprenticeship start, and the percentage of employers with at least one apprenticeship start. And we can see that those levels, at least most recently, have been quite significantly lower than in previous years. On top of this, the government also supports training by employers through corporation tax relief, and supports self-employed people through PAYE relief. This chart here shows our calculations, which try to estimate the total value of those reliefs, which we estimate to be somewhere between 1.3 and 2 billion pounds. So it's a substantial form of government support for employer investment in skills. But it passively follows employer decisions and actually does quite little to tackle that underinvestment in training among those with the fewest qualifications. And crucially, it also only provides incentive for employers who are making a profit. So just in summary, employers are big investors in skills, but we've seen that investment was declining prior to the pandemic. It fell sharply during the pandemic, and access to training opportunities and workplace learning opportunities is highly unequal, and government investment at times reinforces these inequalities. So it's clear that we need greater action to reverse these trends and address inequalities. And as Stephen I think has said, we'll be looking at that and those kind of policy options in more detail in our next report. But for now, I'll stop there. As always, very happy to take questions, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you. So a succession of alarming graphs there, heading in the wrong direction. So an alarming start, but we're going to get through to what we're going to do about this. But I think that sort of overall picture of 20 million fewer training days than if training had stayed at 2011 levels. And by the way, back in 2011, it wasn't like we were in workplace skills nirvana, was it? So I remember writing reports back then and before then about how we needed to increase collective investment in skills. So 20 million fewer training days since 2011, and if we raised training at work participation rates for everybody up to the levels of those who've got degrees or above, 1.2 million more people would get training, And then we've got that £6.5 billion gap if we compared to if we invested per person into EU levels. I know we're not in the EU anymore, but other comparisons I'm sure are available as well. So that's kind of quite a worrying picture about overall levels of investment in the context of a UK economy where we do invest less than other countries in all kinds of things. And then also that disparity between sectors and between groups, which and then lastly, so the last bit of alarming news, government policy either passively follows those inequalities or in some cases now is actively reinforcing them, which in my personal view, we'll get into the discussion on this, is the exact opposite of what public policy objectives should be. So lots to kind of chew over and work out, does that picture resonate? There's lots of really brilliant stuff going on, some amazing employers. How do we make them the norm? And then what do we need to do in terms of policy as well? So lots of big questions. And we've got a big panel to run through that. I can see some questions coming through the Q&A on Slido, so please do keep those coming in. And I can see there's one about whether apprenticeship levy spend will be included in that employer investment figure that we quoted. I think the answer to that is yes, because the employer skills survey measures all employer spending on skills and training. So we can answer that one. So just before I introduce our first speaker, there is also a poll which we can now open up. So this should be on the polls tab in Slido, and you can see it on the screen as well. And we kind of set out what we think some of the current picture is. So the question is, well, what should the government be doing about this? What should the government do to try and increase employer investment in workers with lower qualifications? So answer one, it should try to persuade them, but ultimately it's up to the employer. Answer two, we should try and financially incentivise them. So that could be through the Apprenticeship Levy, for example. Or answer three, the government should just directly fund free training for those with lower qualifications. So is it persuade, but it's up to the employer? Is it incentivise, including through the levy rules? Or is it just directly provide free training for those groups? So please get voting. I see the voting numbers ticking up. So vote early, vote often. And we'll come back to the results of that a bit later. If there's other things you think should be done, again, do put them into the Q&A as well. So whilst everyone's voting away and putting in their questions, I'll start to go through our panel. We've got quite a few panelists, so I know you're all going to be very strict on your 5-minute initial limit, so we've got plenty of time for discussion. And I'm going to start with Graham Hastings-Evans, the Managing Director of NOCN. And Graham, I'm interested in your views about whether the picture we've painted, whether that resonates. You're working with employers every day, and also what do we need to do to try and shift that picture a little bit?
Yep. Thanks very much, Stephen. I hope you can all hear me. I'm also, if that's okay, Steve, give you a view probably from the training provider perspective because of my work with colleges and private training providers, as it will give a perspective perhaps different to some of the other speakers. I think what I find in the report is that it busts a few myths, but it isn't surprising. I think the problem is we have a set of government policies that don't match particularly well the needs of the country. There's some good things in the policies, but there's some thumping great gaps. And in that sense, I think they are reinforcing, as you have said, some of the habits that are already there in the marketplace. And you would expect the government to fill the gaps, not sort of enhance the direction. And that's not been happening. If we look at how training providers can perhaps help that and help employers with that, we have to realise that government spending and government funding does drive behaviours quite considerably. So if the government won't fund something, then the chances are it won't happen very much. And if the government doesn't fund, say, management training, then that doesn't happen. If it doesn't fund level 2 and below, and there's a lot of worrying noises about it stopping doing that, then we won't be able to plug some of those gaps. Notwithstanding that, training providers over the last, say, 5 years since the government's been trying to guide the skills system down much more of an employer-led route, which is the right thing to do, those training providers have been better aligning what they do to match the employer's needs. But there's more to do. Yeah, I think there's much more to do to ensure that the standards of training do match what we want in terms of the future. And I don't just mean qualifications, I do mean apprenticeships. And particularly, I think a major gap in the government thinking at the moment is short courses for upskilling, as well as how we tackle the youth problem that you've alluded to. And there is also the whole area where I think training providers can better improve the support that they give to employers. It's the major strategic changes that are taking place all around us in the way the economy, the global economy and our economy work. So COVID has taught us that we will live in a much more digital world, and we need to be able to sort of track that and support employers in moving through that process of a more digitized world. The environment is really helpful. Really important. We've got to help employers with how they change the way they work, the skills that their workforce have got, and to also recognise the difference in local priorities. We have had over the last 5 years, I believe, a one-size-fits-all approach. It's the Apprenticeship Levy or it's nothing. But there are local priorities that vary in different parts of the UK and different parts of England. We've got to reshape that, and I think the training providers need to play their part in that. Training providers need to be able to invest. They need to be able to explain the benefits of training to employers, to help employers fight their way through the jungle of the funding options, to work against some of those constraints that are there, to be as flexible as they can be, and they themselves as training providers to invest in what they do, and to move more and more online and digital, and to help people with management training, improvements in productivity, helping young people get into the right type of job, raising up those skills within the workforce, and helping the economy and sectors to adapt to completely new methods such as offsite manufacturing, in banking, fintech, all of these changes that are going to take place. I think we need to support the sector and employers in how they make that change. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Graham. That's a really helpful set of insights and questions and topics for us to focus on through the discussion as well. And I'm going to go through our speakers and then bring in as many questions as I can. They're sort of flowing through now. And our next speaker is Matthew Percival, the Director of People and Skills at the CBI. And Matthew, so thank you for being with us. There's a sort of, I'll perhaps put to you a couple of points that have kind of come through the questions really, because it's quite a challenging report, I think, for employers. You know, I think the government ought to invest more and policy ought to be better, but this is also about employers and how they invest. And so Dominic asked, for example, you know, where do employers think their skilled workers are going to come from if they're not investing? But then someone else has said, up as anonymous on the chat, employers are going to focus on their business needs first. You can't sort of expect employers to be responsible for social justice. So how can we, I mean, do you recognise the picture we painted in that report? And then also, how can we balance that sort of the longer term needs of the economy and public policy objectives around social justice, with employers quite rightly focusing on how they run their businesses and what's best for them as employers?
I'll try and pick up a little of that in my remarks. I think, yes, there are elements of this that I recognise, and to an extent, I'm also acutely conscious that my membership is probably disproportionately at the inclined to be investing end relative to not, say, if you're a business that comes forward to a business organisation and says, I'm really interested in skills policy and want to talk about it, you're probably not the disengaged, not investing currently cohort. You've spoken about what's happened in the past. I think to think about the challenge in the present, I'd also like to look slightly forwards, because work that we were doing last year was forecasting not where are our skills gaps at the moment, but where are the potential for new skills gaps in the future, and what does that mean for levels of investment that will be required, and what do we need to do to try and get there. And that research was saying we expect 9 in 10 workers will need to gain new skills by 2030, and 1 in 6 will be needing to update more than 20% of their skills, which was our definition for a more substantial retraining. And the cost of just stopping new gaps emerging is an additional £13 billion investment each year. So as much as you've charted this picture of investment in the past, the conversation I'm having with my members is the challenge in front of us: boosting adult education, reskilling, responding to the skills needed for net zero, the skills needed to make the most of the productivity potential of adopting new technology, changing structure of the economy. These things are going to cost money. How do we create the right environment in which we can get this extra 13 billion, which we were estimating was about a 25% increase on current levels of investments? And that broadly matches, I think, with the numbers that have come through in your research. I'm not going to go into specific numbers here because I'm going to be doing my own report launch in a few weeks' time, Stephen, so I won't spike that one just yet. But I've had my education and skills survey in the field in the last few months, and it does have a story of how our business is thinking about their investment priorities, both relative to the last year, where, of course, I think you'd expect a strong rebound compared to the last year's investment in skills if it crashed in response to, frankly, large parts of the economy being closed. But we also included in there questions around using the pre-pandemic level as their point of reference rather than just last year. And there is a good proportion, but by no means large enough, I don't think, to meet the scale of the challenge of the increase in investment I've described as needing. A good proportion of firms who are saying they intend to be having higher levels of investment in the coming 12 months than they did in the year before the pandemic hit. I think one of the challenges that speaks maybe to this question that I think you were getting at with your comment around can you expect businesses to invest in issues that are primarily driven by social justice? If I rephrase it slightly, would one business train somebody in skills needed to progress their career but not needed for that business? And I think that's one of the really tricky areas in all of this, and where I think there is definitely a role for public policy in helping to address those market failures. Our research says there's a business case for investment in skills in 75% of the skills gaps that we forecast emerging over the next decade. But that's 25% where they don't. And I think understanding when there is a return on investment for the business that makes the investment, and then we should be creating an environment and an expectation on businesses to get on with it, but using policy to address the 25% where it's not, and really enabling the learner to access information about the skills they can gain that help them to progress their career, where progression isn't going to be in the role that they're in, where they are, or even with the employer, or maybe even in the industry that they're currently in. And how we help people gain skills that help them move through the economy in different ways, rather than just move in a linear way, as many people will, but not everybody will, in a linear way with their current employer. I know you've got your future work coming up on what some of the policy solutions are, but I think one of the things that's often misunderstood is business critiques of the Apprenticeship Levy. And I think one of the things it's worth saying is there's this tension inherent in the design of the levy. It's both a tax for funding SME support for apprenticeships, but it's also a use it or lose it incentive for businesses. But there's this cat and mouse game where if businesses are using too much of it, frankly, there's not enough money left to fund the other end. And so, and let's remember back to when the Apprenticeship Levy was set up, when there was a quite open encouragement by a previous government, not the current crop of ministers and not DfE's current approach, but back then telling businesses to rebadge everything as an apprenticeship in order to meet a number of apprenticeships target. There's more of a focus on quality of apprenticeship now rather than numbers from government. But where the use it or lose it incentive is restricted exclusively to apprenticeships, that's where we've got businesses trying to deliver training that was not previously delivered as an apprenticeship in the form of one. And I think it's an inevitable tension when you try to raise revenue as a tax and also create a use it or lose it incentive through one mechanism, that it can never quite do either properly. And for us, we're coming into a moment where we think separating those two things out so we can create a genuine use it or lose it incentive, but not restricting it only to apprenticeships, because lots of training needs aren't in that form, would be helpful. Meanwhile, having a very clear, this is a tax and is funding the apprenticeship system, separating those two things, I think would be hugely beneficial to boosting investment. Because we do hear it whenever we have conversations with businesses around increasing investment in skills. The first challenge is, I've got a use it or lose it pot over there of apprenticeship money. We're not tapping into it as much as we'd like to. Go and try and do that first before I release other investment. And I think if we can overcome that barrier, that would be hugely beneficial to trying to have the conversation we need to have with businesses about raising this extra 13 billion. I think the final thing I'll say around investment is, I think we need to get comfortable with investing in skills, not only in qualifications, when it comes to public money. And that's one of the things that comes forward most frequently from businesses. There is a growing acknowledgement, and we heard it just a moment ago as well, around the more modular and flexible learning for reskilling that's needed, and those small steps that people will make to update their skills, rather than big bang, lengthier periods out of work for full-time retraining. It's much more often this topping up of skills. And again, something that's coming through in our most recent surveys, where a business is most concerned they can't access the skills they need, it's whenever those skills don't fit the models of formal qualifications and the education system. The providers are incentivized so strongly by government to be measured in delivery of qualifications rather than necessarily in delivery of some of the skills that businesses say that they need.
Great, thanks, Matthew. And I think some points really well made about we've kind of ended up with an apprenticeship levy system that's trying to do everything, and it can't do that. And the kind of the world ahead is that sort of flexible, kind of career changing and modules and all these sorts of things, and that kind of requires a much more joined up and flexible and open system. And also I kind of take the point as well about we must be careful not sort of saying sometimes this debate gets boiled down to high skills are productivity and low skills are social justice. And this is, first of all, there's only one winner in a public policy debate on that, but second of all, it's just wrong, because those lower level qualifications can boost productivity, and the higher ones can be about social mobility, depending on who's doing them as well. So I think all points really well made, and we'll pick up further in the discussion as well. Just a reminder as well, if you can kind of keep voting away in the poll. I'm going to close that off after we've heard from our final two speakers, so that's your kind of time warning. But next I'm going to introduce Anya Mayacord, who's a labour market economist at the OECD. And Anya, we've kind of presented results and findings about England and the UK. But I'm kind of interested in your perspective about whether this is a bit of a common theme that you see across quite a few other countries, and also, kind of are there other countries, policies in other countries we should be picking up on or learning from, and what's your assessment of the state of play here? So Anya, over to you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yes, I want to talk a little bit about the UK international comparison. Of course, that's what we're looking at the OECD. And I'm going to start talking about the employer investment in training. Maybe I should start with saying that we don't have great data on investment in training at the international level. I believe that you have really already scraped together most of the existing data for your report. So I'm not going to say that much new, but I do want to say that I think the data in the UK in international comparison paints quite a mixed picture. So on the one hand, you have this data from the survey of the European Investment Bank that shows that in 2020, 12% of firms in the UK invested in training of employees. So that's higher than in the US, where it's 10%, or higher than in the EU, where it's 9%. But then on the other hand, you have this data from the Continuing Vocational Education and Training Survey from 2015, admittedly, so it's a bit older. That suggests that enterprises in the UK train a smaller share of employees than elsewhere. So according to that data, only 32% of enterprises train more than 50% of the employees, so more than half the employees in any given year, while this is about 40% on average in the OECD. And this probably explains the low per employee investment that you highlight in your report as well. So I think it's therefore important to ask, and as you do also in your report, whose training do employers actually invest in? And we've recently actually taken a deep dive in 100 enterprises in 5 countries where we conducted case studies, and we collected some new data on training in enterprises. And we find that it's mostly employees in office positions or where training is subject to legal requirements, for example, accountants, but also high-skilled employees and new hires that receive more training than other groups. So this is very much due to these differences to employer investment decisions, because they assume that the benefits are higher and the costs are lower for providing training to these groups of employees. So this is really something we see across the OECD. As Nomi said in her presentation, we also do know, though, that the international evidence base on the case for employer investment in training is very clear. Yeah, and all the research points towards the very positive effects for individuals, for firms, for society. So, as Nomi has already said, for individuals, translates into higher wages, better career prospects for firms, and increases employer productivity and therefore also firm performance. And there is also an emerging evidence base on the societal benefits of training. So what regards health outcomes, well-being, social and political attitudes. And this is why, of course, the picture of the decreased investments that you paint in your report is quite worrying. And we do see some interesting patterns of employer investment in training during the pandemic, also in our own research, in particular what concerns online learning. So in these 100 enterprises that we looked at in our case studies, many of these enterprises had to cancel or postpone learning during the pandemic, naturally, because of the restrictions that came with the pandemic. But larger and often multinational enterprises were able to shift this learning online because they had the existing infrastructure in many cases already. But medium enterprises often didn't have the pre-existing infrastructure to do so. So what we really observe is that the pandemic was a real accelerator of existing trends and may further increase this gap in training investment between small and medium enterprises and larger enterprises that we already see. So you ask, what do other countries do to support employers to invest in skills and to close these gaps? Before I answer this question, I would first like to take a quick step back and ask the question of why enterprises should be supported at all. Why should we put public money into what you might consider a job that enterprises should do anyway to train their workforce? But in our view, there's really 2 arguments for this. So the first one is some enterprises might be under providing training compared to what would be optimal to them. So for example, our research again confirms all these barriers that especially small and medium enterprises face, informational barriers, attitudinal barriers, capacity barriers to training. And why do we care about addressing these barriers? Because of course, this ultimately leads to higher productivity, higher wages, and therefore higher well-being for all. But the second argument is also that some enterprises may be providing an optimal amount of training for them, but they're not taking into account the wider economic and social benefits of training in their decision making. And I think you mentioned it before, Stephen, the classic example is the training of low-skilled adults. So it may not be economically beneficial for a firm necessarily to train these individuals if they do a very hard cost-benefit calculation, but it is beneficial for society overall. So in this case, an intervention may also be justified. Okay, so we've established why we think there is a need for intervention, but let's think about the how. So in our forthcoming report, we set out a toolbox of instruments that we observe internationally, of instruments that are used to support enterprises in training. And these really range from information and guidance for enterprises over capacity building to financial incentives, then the direct provision of training, and to regulation. So you could imagine that sort of a ever from soft to hard instruments, from sort of information guidance to regulation through laws and other rules. But I wanted to pick out capacity building, because what we've seen at the OECD is there's really an increased interest by countries in these types of interventions. And I read that there's some recent initiatives for that as well in the UK. But for example, in Germany, there is a program called People as Corporate Value, Unternehmenswert Mensch in German, where the Ministry of Employment subsidizes consultancy services for small and medium enterprises to develop modern people-centered human resource strategies. So it's basically they can have access to a set of certified consultants, and the cost of that consultant is subsidized by the Federal Ministry of Employment. But there are, of course, many other ways to build capacity for training in enterprises, including through building joint capacity of enterprises, through training networks. There's this very successful example from Ireland that has a good practice called SkillsNet. But I think to conclude, I do want to say that there's, of course, no one-size-fits-all solution. I think I say this in every presentation that I give, where I give an international overview. But we have included a checklist of 7 questions that policymakers should ask themselves when designing interventions to support training in enterprises in this report that we have forthcoming. And I think the most important one is, how will enterprises find out about the intervention? Because the most important issue, which is true for individuals and for enterprises, is that some groups train more than others, and we need to make greater efforts to reach out to those individual and enterprises with these support measures to those that need it most. And I'll hand it back to you, Stephen.
Great, thanks, Anya. And lots to pick up on there. That German example that you mentioned sounds a little bit not dissimilar to Help to Grow, which was announced recently in the UK to try and give SMEs some consultancy support about management and leadership skills and how they can help them to grow as part of that. And we know that leadership and management is relatively low in the UK, with the notable exception, I'm sure, of every organisation represented on this event, and that's a key holding back on in terms of productivity. So be very interested to learn some more about that, for example. But before we do that, a sort of last reminder to sort of vote in the poll. I can see loads of people have already done that. We're going to be closing that off shortly and giving you the results. But before we do so, I'm going to ask our final speaker to give their contribution. So Lloyd Thomas, who's the apprenticeship partner for the Co-op Group. And Lloyd, I know we've done a lot of research at the Learning and Work Institute about fair access to apprenticeships and some of the disparities. And I know that that's something that's very close to your and the Co-op's heart. So I'll pass over to you.
Brilliant, thank you, Stephen. Yes, I've worked in apprenticeships in some guise or another now for 25 years. And obviously an awful lot has changed in that time, originally starting in training provision and then moving into working with sort of food and specialist retail for the last 20 years. I think apprenticeships in general are important to grow and develop because of the future skills need that we talk about, and everybody's mentioned it in some guise or another. And that future talent pipeline. However, I do agree with both Graham and Matthew that it isn't necessarily the only way of addressing the skills gap. You know, it may be that they don't need that full year and a week as a minimum of a full apprenticeship. It may be that actually there's a 3-month solution or a 6-month solution. So I completely agree with that. We also need to ensure that apprenticeships are relevant for the job that is happening now, because things change so quickly, innovation, new roles, all sorts of things that change, and we need to make sure that those apprenticeship standards are absolutely right and useful for what the job is now, and looking to the future to see what will be needed. We need to ensure that future skill need is assessed and actioned. So actually, until we know what we need, it's hard to find and therefore hard to ensure that it is incorporated into apprenticeship standards. And we also use apprenticeships in Co-op to change career direction. So within our business areas, some people will move. They may work in food and have a passion to go to funeral care. They may want to go into Co-op legal services. So we do use apprenticeships for career movers as well. Within Co-op, we aim to keep about 1,000 apprentices on programme at any one time. and that's across all of our main business areas. So as mentioned, food, funeral care, co-op legal services, support centre, and logistics. And we currently offer apprenticeship standards from level 2 up to level 7. Examples are level 2 retailer, level 3 funeral director, LGV driver, and up to level 7 we are just about to start 5 solicitors in our legal services business, which is great. As I say, new to role apprentices, young apprentices are absolutely one of our key areas. We also see quite a lot of career changes, especially in our funeral care business, where people might come into the sector in their 40s and 50s, having perhaps retired early from, and historically might be nursing, military, police. So there is definitely an opportunity there. I think everybody's mentioned at some point the apprenticeship levy. It's significant. So for us at Co-op, it's about £5.3 million a year that we invest. And it costs us approximately 2 million of that to run the programme with 1,000 apprentices at any one time. So back to Matthew's point, on that use it or lose it model, we then started to investigate Levyshare. So being able to donate up to 25% of your levy spend that would otherwise potentially be unspent and go back to Treasury. And that was when we started to form some great partnerships. The first one we started was 42 firefighters in Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue, being a Manchester-based business. That led on to conversations with the London Ambulance Service, and has subsequently led on to conversations with the Staffordshire Police. And that's where we're looking to directly support those businesses that may pay levy in their own right, but haven't got enough levy to be able to realise their apprenticeship ambition, or it could be SMEs that are unable to make the 5% contribution. And that started us to think a little bit differently when we started on that journey around what could we do to encourage more people to be able to use their unspent levy for the good. And what we did then really was we created back in May the Co-op Levy sharing scheme. So Co-op Levyshare is just purely to encourage our suppliers, supply chain, and our network of other employers to think about, could they make a commitment from their unspent levy to have a pledge pot, which we're aiming to get up to £15 million. So that was created back in May. Initially, we were working with Business in the Community, BITC, and their Race Equality group to look at actually how do we ensure that we support the communities and the people that need that help, or our help, the most. And of course, that then started to widen to look at other underrepresented groups. And what was the need there? What was the skills need of the community? What was the opportunity need for the young people involved? And how could we bring those together? So we've created a Levyshare platform, which is where donating employers can go on and pledge, and receiving employers can go on and say, actually, this is what we'd like. We'd like 3 apprentices at this level doing this particular apprenticeship standard and to this value. And that's working really well. So to date, we've got £3.6 million in pledges. It's supported 101 apprentice matches as of last week, and to a value of about 500,000. And we're seeing a real mix of sectors, which is great because we can only operate in certain ones ourselves. So we're seeing engineering, we're seeing care, we're seeing construction, we're seeing health and science. And again, a nice mix of levels from level 2 up to level 6. So what have we learned? What we've learned on the journey is that a lot of employers would rather see their unspent levy money focused to an employer or a group of employers that share their values and their principles and their vision and their strategy. So we're absolutely seeing employers who want to target that funding that would otherwise become expired into something that is relevant to them. We've looking to focus on companies that align obviously with our values, and we do ask that the companies that are looking to receive funds are making it really clear how they're supporting underrepresentation. And we continue to network with other organisations, both large and small, and trying to support them in as many ways as they can. And that relationship between the two can be purely about apprenticeships, but actually wouldn't it be great if they could then put them in contact with their marketing contact or their finance contact and broaden it from there.
Great, fabulous. Thanks, Lloyd, and some really good sort of practical examples there, sort of making a difference and then broadening out that conversation. So what I'm going to do now, as promised, I think if we could close off the poll and if we could pop up the results on the screen, please. Let's see who you've all voted for, or which option you've all voted for. So a reminder, the question was, what should the government do to increase employer investment in those with lower qualifications? And there you go. So not many people saying exhortation, but ultimately it's down to employers. And then a kind of clear lead for directly funding training for lower qualified employees, with then also a sizable chunk of people talking about financial incentives as well. So there you go. That gives us, thank you everyone for voting in that. That gives us some food for thought during the discussion. Now we've got a grand total of 9 minutes, so I'm going to have to ask for some rapid fire answers if you wouldn't mind, please. We can just get through as many as possible. And Matthew, perhaps if I start with you, if I may. I mean, you talked about the employers that are directly engaged with you currently about what should happen to the skills system are probably the ones that are pretty engaged anyway. So how do you get to the others? And that's a question that's also come up in terms of, you know, some employers won't have HR functions or large HR functions, for example. So how do we get to those employers who are not engaged? What would be your view about that?
Well, I'm putting a lot of eggs in the college business centres basket, if that jargon is familiar to everyone. You know, the proposal that the government's brought forward in its white paper, and that it's looking to do some pilots of soon. The thing that excites me about that idea is it's trying to say that it will create an entry point into the skills system for a business that might not be confident being able to understand what its future skills needs will be, let alone how to actually engage with the right bit of the skills system, which I think numerous of us have described as sort of nebulous and multifaceted already, and how you navigate those different funding pots. So I think the onus is on how do we work with the department to try and get those pilots to be set up as well as possible before they start, then for us to plug in the businesses in those local areas to get them engaged with it and to try and use it in that pilot, and then learn as much as we can from it in the hope of building a lasting piece there, so that we're not just relying on those who will be CBI members or other business organisations are available and they will do an equal job in trying to signpost how to get into this system. But for me, the new thing that we're really trying to invest behind is make a success of government's CBC proposals.
Great, thank you. And perhaps if I can move across to Graham next. Graham, there's a kind of a number of people, both in the discussion and in the Q&A as well, have mentioned sort of flexibility of learning and modular learning and things like that. But there's a kind of balance between, we kind of sometimes end up with full qualifications because we think that's what will give the most value, or that's what the next employer might recognise. So what's your kind of sense about how we balance that sort of micro credentials world of flexibility versus employers and employees having something that's portable and recognised?
Yeah, I think what we need to do, and the government in a way has started by trying to define sort of what are the skills and competencies that somebody needs to do an occupation. I think the trick we've lost in all of that with the apprenticeships is, yeah, it's not one big skill. There's maybe 10, 20, 30 components of that, yes? And if you therefore make sure you've got the components for occupations, then you can be much more flexible. I'll give a great example from Hong Kong. Hong Kong wanted to introduce new digital technologies across the construction industry. So they had one module that they applied then to 200 occupations as a common piece of learning. And we've got that with the green skills that are necessary. So I think there's lots of great examples, digital skills, etc., where this component approach is exactly what we need for upskilling the 33 million people that are in the existing workforce.
Brilliant, thank you. You're all being very concise. Thank you. Naomi, let me come across to you next. I was going to ask you a very leading question, but I'm going to phrase it more neutrally now, because I think I should. So one of the things I think was quite interesting in the report is about the differences in training take up by sector, and also how they've changed during the pandemic, and in particular, you might argue the sectors that need it most are doing it less. And I'm kind of interested in, is that something you kind of picked up through there? And, to what extent is policy reinforcing or trying to tackle that?
Yeah, so clearly, through the research, we found some quite clear sectoral differences in terms of patterns of investment by employers. So, as I said in the presentation, in terms of kind of levels of investment and in kind of average investment per trainee and employees, it tends to be lower in lower wage, lower productivity sectors like kind of retail and hospitality, and higher in those kind of higher value sectors like business services and IT, which is kind of no surprise really, given what we know about the impacts of investment in workforce development and skills on productivity. But we've also seen this diverging, not just in the pandemic, but prior to the pandemic. So falling levels of investment amongst kind of retail and hospitality businesses, and increasing levels of investment amongst those kind of higher value, higher kind of knowledge intensive sectors that I mentioned. And you look at things like the kind of corporate tax relief, and the impacts that that's having. It really only incentivizes businesses who are making a profit. So it's less likely to act as an incentive and encourage employers in potentially some of those lower value sectors who are less likely to make a profit, and are employing more of those people with lower level qualifications and on lower wages. So effectively, policy at the moment isn't doing a huge amount to tackle those discrepancies.
Okay, thank you. And Lloyd, a sort of quick question for you. A couple of people have said that kind of sounds on the Q&A, it kind of sounds like what you're doing is really good and really sensible, but you're trying to do it within quite a restrictive set of rules. So if there's one thing we could do in terms of the rules, or the government could do in terms of the rules to make it a bit easier to do the sorts of things that you're talking about, what would it be?
Yeah, I think more flexibility in the levy, which isn't going to be news to anybody really. I think there's issues with, especially when we look at some of those automated scheduling occupations with the 20%, everybody's prepared to make the contribution, but I think more flexibility around that, and actually possibly an increase in how much you can share. Because that wouldn't really cost an awful lot, but would still be able to target that money going to where the employer wanted it to go to.
Great, thank you. Duly noted. We've made a note of that. And Anya, last word to you. One of the things that struck me putting this report together was that a lot of our policy towards employer training seems to be just completely isolated from each other. So no one talks about the tax relief, for example, that we've talked about really. And then there's an apprenticeship levy, and then there's a national skills fund, and there's this, that, and the other. They all seem very separate. Now, is there a kind of, I'm going to ask you a very leading question as well, but is there an example of I suspect all countries are a little bit similar, but are there better ways that we could integrate this together and do it in a more joined up way?
Now, it's a good question. I do think it's symptomatic of sort of how just training systems are set up in most countries, because they're not really systems ever. They're just these landscapes with different actors, with different goals, bringing together different kind of provisions. So yeah, we see that everywhere. I mean, where is it a little bit more aligned? I do think it is probably in those countries that are taking a more statist approach. So if I think about the Nordics, for example, they deliver a lot of their training through state-run institutions, everything from, their vocational schools to adult learning centers, etc. And often there, because the funding all comes from a Ministry of Education there, it is more structured. But I mean, that's a completely different setup, probably not directly applicable to the UK. But no, and of course, there's many ways in which those different instruments can be brought together, through having a coherent skill strategy, through having different fora in which this exchange can take place, etc. I mean, other countries are doing that as well. I've just finished a report on Germany where they did, for the first time ever, a national skill strategy trying to structure all the different approaches they have in the country, and that's a massive job. So I think that's a good effort, and is always commendable to countries to think the whole system together once.
No, I think a national strategy is something we've called for England, for example. So we'll kind of look out for that report. I know Ireland's publishing an adult literacy strategy in the coming period of time as well. So that's something for everyone to look out for as well. Listen, I know we had to rattle through a lot there, but that's because we had a lot of really excellent speakers and a lot of really interesting topics to get through. And I think the range of Q&A that we got through quite a few of those questions. I grouped them together, but there was lots we didn't, and that shows the engagement. I'm really grateful for everybody who spoke at today's event. So thank you to all of you for your contributions. Thank you to everyone who dialed in and kind of got active within the poll and the Q&A as well. Thank you once again to NOCN for their support for this report and for the Festival of Learning as well. It's greatly appreciated. And Matthew plugged the forthcoming CBI report, which we'll all look out for. I shall finish by plugging our next report, which will come up in the autumn, which will look at what can we do about this, which was partly why I was fishing for some ideas there from Anya and from others. So thank you so much to everyone for your contributions and for taking part in the event today, and have a great rest of your day.